Well, tonight we're going to look at Acts chapter 27, and we're going to focus on verses 1 through 8. We've come to the last section in the book of Acts. We finished last week with what we could call the legal section, all the trials that Paul went through, both before Roman authorities and the last one before a Jewish authority. They all have proclaimed him innocent, not guilty of breaking either Roman law or Jewish law, but Paul has appealed his case to Caesar. And as a Roman citizen, he had the right to do that. And because he has appealed his case to Caesar he shall go. The problem is he's a long way from Rome. He's in Caesarea, and it's a long journey to Rome. So this last section that we're going to take a look at is called Paul's Journey to Rome and His Witness in Rome. And this will cover Acts chapters 27 and 28. What's interesting is the journey to Rome will cover all of chapter 27 and half of chapter 28. His witness in Rome is just the last half of chapter 28. So there's a fascinating story that we're going to take a look at. Before we jump into all of this, as we come to the final section in this book, a lot of the major themes that we've talked about since chapter 1 will resurface in chapters 27 and 28. So before we jump into the story, I thought it would do us well to talk about some of those major themes. So whether you have just recently joined this study or you are here all the way from chapter 1, this will kind of be a review and also kind of bring some of those major themes together. And one of the big themes in the book of Acts is Paul's journeys. Paul's first journey came from the church at Antioch. They commissioned Paul and Barnabas, and Paul went on his first missionary journey. As it turns out, he goes on 3 missionary journeys as we define them. And he visits many, many places throughout his journeys. And some of those places that he visited were Galatia and Ephesus. He was in Macedonia, Greece, and other places. So Paul has been on the move throughout the book of Acts. Now he's going to begin another journey because he has to travel all the way from Caesarea to Rome. This time it will not be by land. Most of Paul's travels were by land. This will be a voyage by sea. And Paul has to make that very long trip from Caesarea to Rome. And unlike most of his other travels, things are not going to go well on this journey. There's going to be a major storm that's going to come up. There's going to be a shipwreck that's going to take place, and things are going to get rather interesting. But throughout the book of Acts, Paul has traveled so that he can share the gospel in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the uttermost part of the earth. That shipwreck brings up another major theme, and that is the theme of God's providence. God's providence is the fact that God is in control, and God's will be accomplished. In chapter 24, verse 27, an angel is going to appear to Paul, and he's going to tell Paul that God's going to keep his promise, that you're going to end up in Rome, and everyone else on this boat will survive as well. That promise is very important because at that moment, everybody on the boat thought they were going to die. And now the angel says to Paul, you're not going to die, you're going to live, you're going to make it to Rome, and so is everybody else. So basically the entire boat gives up in fear, but Paul becomes a person of faith because he has a promise from God. God had already revealed to Paul way back in Acts chapter 19, verse 21, that he would eventually make it to Rome. In fact, it became one of Paul's dreams that he could proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ in the capital city of the Roman Empire. And that was his goal, to go to Rome and proclaim Christ. Then when Paul gets arrested in Jerusalem, and it looks like he's never going to get out of Jerusalem alive, again, God appears to him and tells him, you're going to survive, and you're going to make it to Rome. So, at least 3 times, God promises Paul that he's going to survive and one day end up in Rome to proclaim the message of Christ. And the message is that God's will always take place. God's will always be fulfilled. And when we're at the same time looking at God's will, just because it's God's will doesn't mean everything's going to go smoothly. In fact, things don't go smoothly. It's God's will that Paul makes it to Rome, but it's going to be a rough journey to get there. Sometimes we think if it's God's will, then everything will just fall into place and everything will be easy, but not always the case. Sometimes there are obstacles fighting against the will of God. And when that happens, we have a choice. We can focus on the obstacles, or we can focus on God's will. And many times in life, what do we focus on? Yeah, the obstacles. You know, we're so caught up in the obstacles, we forgot about God's will. But Paul gives us a great example of someone who's always focused on the will of God and the promises of God. He keeps his faith through this whole thing because he knows that God is in charge and God made him a promise and God always keeps his promises. That leads us to the third theme, which is the triumph of the gospel. In the book of Acts, Christians often find themselves in extreme circumstances. Sometimes they're imprisoned. Peter was imprisoned. Paul spent a lot of time imprisoned. Sometimes they actually give their life. Stephen, James, both give their life for the cause of the gospel. Sometimes they are stoned by an angry mob. Stephen, that's how he dies. He's stoned by an angry mob. Paul gets stoned at Lystra, but somehow he survives. Sometimes God delivers the apostles, not because of who they are, but because of what they proclaim. It's not the apostles who triumph. It's the message of Christianity that triumphs. And the greatest example of that is the life of Stephen, who gives his life for the sake of the gospel. But because of his death, the gospel spreads. It spreads to Judea and Samaria and to other places throughout the Roman Empire. So even though the servant of God gave his life, it's the gospel that will triumph. Paul is spared so that he can give witness to Christ in the city of Rome. In fact, the book will close in chapter 28, verse 31, indicating that Paul is able, unrestricted, to proclaim the message of Christ in Rome. It's the gospel that triumphs throughout the book of Acts. The fourth theme, a very important theme that we've talked about many times, is the relationship between Christianity and Judaism. Throughout the book of Acts, it's understood that the Roman government has given the Jewish people freedom of religion. So Judaism is an officially recognized religion in the Roman Empire. And so the relationship between Christianity and Judaism is very important. And Paul is going to argue again and again, and we've seen that Christianity is the fulfillment of Judaism. All of its roots and all of its promises are in the Jewish faith. And therefore, since Judaism is an official legal religion, so should Christianity be too. Also, there's a pattern that takes place in Paul's missionary journeys. And this pattern takes place in almost every city where he evangelizes. Paul goes into a particular city, and while he is there, he goes to the synagogue. He proclaims Jesus to the Jewish people. A few of the Jewish people believe. Those who don't believe get angry at him and kick him out of the synagogue. Then Paul goes on to the Gentile people, and he begins proclaiming Christ to them. And some of them believe, and some of them get angry too, and often Paul gets kicked out of town because of that. But then Paul goes to the next city, and he repeats the same thing. There were several times when Paul got so angry at the Jewish people, he basically said, phooey on you. From now on, I'm going to the Gentiles. But Paul shows up in the next city, and what does he do? He's back in the synagogue. Well, in Acts chapter 28, there's one last dialogue, confrontation between Paul and the Jewish people. And for the last time, Paul says, I'm turning away from you, and I'm turning to the Gentiles. The problem is, there's not another story that follows. It's at the end of the book. There's not another synagogue for Paul to go into. So the story ends with Paul saying, I'm turning away from my fellow Jews, and I'm taking the message of Jesus to Gentiles. And that raises some really tough questions. Questions like, what is the place for the Jewish people in God's history of salvation? And what is the final relationship between Judaism and Christianity? Those are some good questions. I could probably spend an hour talking about them, but I'm not going to. But let me just throw out some things for your consideration, and I'll let you think through those questions. When Paul makes this journey to Rome, it's about AD 60. In 10 years, AD 70, the city of Jerusalem will be destroyed. The temple will be destroyed. And for all practical purposes, the Jewish people lose their country in AD 70. Does that mean that God is finished with the Jewish people? Well, not so fast, because the nation of Israel did become a nation again in 1948. Imagine not being a country from AD 70 all the way to 1948. But in 1948, the nation of Israel was reborn. What is the end of the relationship between Judaism and Christianity? When Jesus returns, he will fulfill all the promises in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. When Jesus returns, those who are still alive in the nation of Israel will welcome him as their Messiah. So at the end, when Jesus returns, to be Jewish and to be a Christian will be the same thing, because the Jewish people will put their faith in Jesus, their Messiah. Today, as we look at that relationship, there doesn't seem to be much of a relationship between Judaism and Christianity. Now, there are some Jewish people who today believe in Jesus as their Messiah. They call themselves completed Jews or Messianic Jews. But there's only a few of them. The nation of Israel, the Jewish people as a whole, have not embraced Jesus as Messiah. But they will when he returns. And so Luke wrestles with that question too, back in the first century. What's going to be the relationship between Judaism and Christianity? How is that going to play out? And that's a major theme that we've seen throughout this book. So I'll leave those questions to you to further think through. The main story in these two chapters is Paul's journey to Rome. It's an extensive story of Paul's journey from Caesarea to Rome. And he goes there, of course, to stand trial before Caesar. Paul had appealed his case to Caesar. He has to go there. And there's this long journey. There's this long sea voyage to get Paul from Caesarea to Rome. And Luke will give us, in considerable detail, the route that was followed. He'll talk about where they stop, all the different ports where the boat ends up. And he also gives us occasionally the period of time in which they stay at each spot. It's interesting that Acts chapters 27 and 28 have been studied by historians about ancient sea travel. How did people back in the first century travel by sea? And a great source of information happens to be Acts chapter 27 and 28. There's a lot of information about sea travel from the first century. In fact, a man named James Smith, back in 1848, wrote a book called The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul. And James Smith was interested in sailing. He was interested in geography. Boats were his life. And he was also fascinated by the writings of Luke. And so James Smith formed this question. As I look at what Luke writes about the journey in chapters 27 and 28, is that an actual journey? I mean, did that journey actually happen the way Luke describes it? You know, would it be possible to make such a journey? And by the way, his book is still in print. You can buy it on Amazon if you so desire. He concluded that the story that Luke tells in these chapters is absolutely possible, it's plausible, it looks like an accurate description of an actual voyage. At the same time, he says it's written by a layman who may be accustomed to sea travel, but he's not a professional sailor. And what we know about Luke, well, fits that profile. Luke was a doctor. He was a great historian, but he certainly wasn't a professional sailor. So Luke is going to write this story from his own experience, because we're going to find out tonight in chapter 27, verse 1, that Luke is able to tell this story in such detail because he's on the boat with Paul. He's not getting this information secondhand. He experiences everything that Paul does on this journey. And in many ways, when we read chapter 27 and 28, we're almost reading a diary of this trip. That day by day, he tells us what happens on this voyage from Caesarea to Rome. So there's a lot of detail that he gives us. At the same time, other scholars look at this story and they say it's a classic piece of literature. This was some of Luke's best writing. He tells an incredible story, building up suspense. There's the dramatic portrayal of the violence of the storm, the description of the sailors, the fact that everybody gives up hope. It's just an intense story and a great story to read. And the fascinating thing about the story is, at the very moment when it looks like all is lost, and it happens a couple times, it's Paul who gives a word of encouragement to everybody else on the boat. I mean, everybody else on the boat is going, we're dead, we're done, we're finished, we're not going to survive this. You know, this is how it's going to end for us. But Paul says, no, my God's not going to let that happen. My God is going to rescue us. We are going to make it safely to Rome. My God has promised me that I'm going to Rome and you're going with me. Paul becomes the hero in the story because he's the only person on the boat with any faith. He's the only person on the boat with any hope that they're actually going to survive. Because Paul says, God has a will for me to go to Rome. And God's will is absolutely going to come to pass. We are going to survive because God promised. And so here's Paul giving an incredible testimony of his faith to every single person on that boat. Another question is, why does Luke record this journey in such detail? He takes a chapter and a half, about 60 verses, to tell the story. Couldn't have he just said, well, Paul set out from Caesarea and so much time later he finally made it to Rome, overcoming a shipwreck in the process? Yes, he could have told the story in 2 or 3 sentences, but that's not how the Greeks would write their history. Telling the great story, the eyewitness account, brings the story to life. And Luke tells this incredible story of how Rome is so far away that we almost didn't make it. But God has protected Paul every step of the way. In many ways, for Luke, when he talks about Jesus' words in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, that you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria to the uttermost part of the earth, in Luke's thinking, the uttermost part of the earth is Rome. Because if you're standing in the nation of Israel, in the city of Jerusalem, Rome is like a lifetime away. It's just so far away. And I know today when we think of the uttermost part of the earth, we think about some group in some other country many, many miles away, some little tribe that's never heard about Jesus. In fact, there are some Bible translators who right now are working on getting at least a New Testament into every known language on planet Earth. And they're hoping to accomplish that project by 2030. And there are these little tribes scattered throughout these various countries. And they're trying to get the gospel to the uttermost part of the earth, as we would see that. But in the eyes of Luke, Rome is so far away, it must be the end of the earth. So, Luke's account also has some incredible themes. The Roman politicians have declared Paul innocent. Felix and Festus have both said, this man has committed no crime against Roman law. The Jewish king, Agrippa II, also concludes, Paul has broken no Roman law, and also he's broken no Jewish law either. The man is innocent. And now, through this sea voyage, both God and creation are going to confirm the innocence of Paul. Because in the mind of the Greeks, if Paul gets on that boat and dies during the journey, it's proof that Paul is guilty all along. The Greeks would say, yeah, the politicians thought he was innocent, but the gods knew better, and they took his life. But the fact that Paul survives in the minds of a Greek, meaning God or the gods, also agree. Paul is innocent. He survives this incredible shipwreck. Another great theme is the character of Paul. He becomes an incredible man of faith. He believes God's promises. He doesn't focus on the obstacles. He seems to ignore them. He focuses on what God promised and working toward that end. He knows that God has promised that his life would be spared. So instead of thinking all the different ways he might die, Paul thinks about all the ways he can survive and live. And he does. He becomes the real hero of this story, a true man of faith, a man who takes God at his word. At the same time, those who listen to Paul, because once we get to the shipwreck, Paul tells everybody what to do. And by following Paul's instructions, everybody survives. Nobody dies. They experience physical deliverance because they listen to Paul's message. At the same time, they can experience spiritual deliverance if they will also listen to Paul's message. An incredible story of faith. Well, tonight we're going to begin that story in Acts chapter 27. And I want to begin by reading verses 1 through 8. That's as far as we're going to get tonight. And if you want to cheat and read ahead for next week, you can. You can read the whole story. It's an incredible story. I'm sure you're going to like this story. Acts chapter 27, beginning with verse 1. When it was decided that we should sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so that they might provide for his needs. From there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved across the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. So already they're making progress. But it's a fascinating story that we're going to take a look at, and it all begins with this journey to Fair Havens. So tonight we'll go from Caesarea to Fair Havens, and that's as far as we'll get tonight. And it all begins in verse 1, and it talks about the fact that we would sail for Italy. Acts has something called the we sections. And whenever you see the word we in the book of Acts, that means that Luke is present on the scene. So when he says that we sail for Italy, he's talking about himself and he's talking about Paul and others. So at the very beginning of chapter 27 in verse 1, we find out that Luke is present with Paul. And this journey, this sea journey all the way to Rome, Luke's going to be there, side by side with his buddy Paul. Apparently he had a diary and was recording things every step of the way. Now we last located Luke all the way back in chapter 21, verse 8. And for the past 2.5 years, Paul has been in Caesarea. And the question is, where has Luke been? Well, Luke doesn't tell us where he's been. Most scholars think he stayed pretty close to Caesarea because that's where Paul was. It could have been during this time that Luke did his research. Luke did some incredible historical research in order to write the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. And it could have been that Luke used these 2.5 years to do some research and to do some writing. At least that would make sense. But now he is in Caesarea, and he's about to get on board a boat along with Paul. They're going to sail to Italy, so Festus, the Roman governor, is about to be released of his responsibilities. Paul has appealed to Caesar, and once he puts Paul on the boat, he's done. His responsibilities are over. In fact, he hands him over, along with some other prisoners, to a centurion named Julius. A centurion was a Roman military officer who was over 100 troops. And so now that he's Julius' responsibility, Festus is off the hook for the rest of the story. We're told about some other prisoners. We have no idea who they are, and Luke doesn't tell us any more about them. other than the fact that apparently several of these prisoners were going to go to Rome. It's said of Julius that he's part of the imperial regiment. It could be that he's a member of an auxiliary fighting force that happens to be headquartered there in Caesarea. And so that's a possibility. Another possibility is that he works for the Roman government to oversee the shipment of grain. The shipment of grain was very important for the Roman Empire. Most of the grain came from Egypt, and it was very important for the economy of Rome that this grain safely reach the Roman Empire. And so Roman military officers were often put in charge to ensure the safety of the grain. But for whatever reason, or whatever his job was, he gets Paul for one reason. He's going to Rome, and he's going to take Paul with him. In verse 2, they boarded a ship from Adramyttium that was to sail the ports along the coast of the province of Asia. Apparently, this ship originated in Adramyttium, and it was going back there. Apparently, it was a slow-moving cargo ship that stayed pretty close to the shore and stopped at port to port in order to either pick up goods or deliver goods. There's another individual on board. His name is Aristarchus. He's from Macedonia in Thessalonica, and he joined Paul and Luke as well. We know that Aristarchus is mentioned in Philemon verse 24 and Colossians chapter 4 verse 10 as a companion and fellow prisoner with Paul. It could very well be that this Christian man is going to join Paul and Luke for this journey. Now, it could be that he's just going home because the boat will stop very close to his hometown. He can get off and continue his way home. But based upon what we have in Colossians and Philemon, it appears that this man decides to take the journey with Paul as well. There's another question that gets raised. How in the world did Luke and Aristarchus get on the boat? How did that work? Well, most of the boats back in the first century were cargo boats, and they were privately owned. And so basically on the boat is cargo, because that's how the individual made most of their money. But if there's room on the boat, then others can join. And apparently there's room on this boat for Paul, Julius, and the other prisoners. And of course, their fare would be paid by Rome. But if there's still room, then other passengers can get on board as well. They just have to pay a fee. And if you've got the money, you can get on the boat. So apparently Luke and Aristarchus paid their way, and they are on the boat. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to visit his friends and provide for his needs. At this point, here's a map. It's a map of Paul's journey to Rome. Next week, I'm going to give you a map of your own that you can take home with you. And if you're watching online, let me encourage you to type in map of Paul's journey to Rome and print out a map. Because here's the deal. With a map, this is a fascinating story. Without a map, you're going to get lost very quickly. So tonight, let me begin by giving you an overview of how we're going to get from Caesarea to Fair Havens. So let me point that out, and I'll point out some of the key parts. I also like this particular map because it gives us some facts as well, and depending upon where you're seated tonight, you may or may not be able to see this. They start right here in Caesarea. And by the way, I tried to do one of those red little pointers. It wouldn't show up on here, so I have to use my own pointer. So we start out in Caesarea, and then we go to Sidon, which Sidon is about 69 nautical miles to get to Sidon. And then from Sidon, the next place to go is Myra. One of the problems is the wind. So they decide to go north to the northern part of Cyprus so they can use Cyprus as a buffer, because the wind is westerly and also northwest, and so Cyprus will be a buffer against all the wind. They will then end up at Myra, and Myra is a major seaport, and it's a major seaport because most of the grain coming from Egypt comes from Alexandria. And as you can tell, Alexandria to Myra is pretty much due north. So a lot of the Egyptian ships would go from Alexandria to Myra and then eventually over to Rome. So from Myra, they really run into some bad weather and some heavy winds, and it completely slows down their journey. And they are trying to get to Crete, which eventually they do. But the goal is to get to Salmone, which is in the northern part of the island. But the wind takes them actually beyond Salome to the southern part of the island. That's not really where they wanted to be. That's just where they ended up. And they end up here at Fair Havens. So that's the journey tonight, from Caesarea to Sidon to Myra to Fair Havens. So that first stop, back in verse 3, is a stop at Sidon. And probably they stopped to unload some cargo. Now, back in ancient times, unloading cargo and reloading cargo was a slow, tedious process. We're not talking hours. We could be talking days. So all the passengers on the ship, those who are not prisoners, of course, they want to get off the boat and go on shore and spend a couple days in town, because the boat's not going anywhere until the cargo is reloaded. But what about the prisoners? It would almost make sense to keep the prisoners on board the boat for security reasons. But Julius shows kindness to Paul and lets him go visit some friends, some Christian friends in Sidon. Now, apparently a Roman soldier or two go with Paul. They just didn't let the guy go free. They didn't want to take that chance. So Paul has some Roman soldiers with him, but he's able to visit some Christians in Sidon. The book of Acts does not tell us how that church got started, but chances are it got started by the Hellenists and their movement of spreading the gospel. And apparently it came to Sidon as well, and there's some Christians there, and Paul has some good Christian company for a few days. They also provide for his needs. Something interesting about life in the first century. You basically had to take care of yourself, or your friends had to take care of you. So Paul's on the boat. That doesn't mean that he's on a luxury cruise liner with food 24/7. You know, if you've ever been on a cruise, I mean, you know, they just keep throwing the food at you, you know. You know, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and, you know, snacks in the afternoon, and a midnight buffet, which I never stayed awake that long to have that, but apparently they did. They just keep throwing the food at you. Not so in the first century. If you buy a ticket on that boat, you better bring your own food if you want to eat, because the captain of the ship is not going to serve you food. So Paul picks up some supplies, some food and other things that he might need for this trip. So this is a great stop at Sidon. From there we put out to sea again and past the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. And again, looking at the map, as they go to Cyprus, they have to go north of Cyprus because of the winds. It just wasn't possible for them to go south of Cyprus. They go north, and that way the island can serve as a buffer against the wind. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. And again, Myra was that major port off of Lycia. It's at the very tip of Asia Minor. Paul had been in Ephesus for 3 years, so he was quite familiar with the territory. And there was a major port there, the port of Andres. And that's the port about 3 miles from Myra, where all the grain came from Egypt. A very important place. That's where all the Egyptian ships came in. And verse 6 says, "There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us aboard." So this ship that they took out of Caesarea was only temporary. It only gets them as far as Myra. And at Myra, that's where all the big grain ships were located. They all came into port, and it was a great place to trade boats. And again, these boats were most likely privately owned. So again, you would simply pay the fare and you can get on board the boat. These boats were actually quite large, over 1,000 tons, over 100 feet in length. And just think about that in the first century. Some incredible craftsmanship, some incredible ingenuity, 2,000 years ago to be able to make this happen. So Paul gets on a brand new boat. And this boat is going to Italy. It's going to Rome. At least it's supposed to go to Rome. Verse 7, "We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete opposite Salmone." And that's really where they wanted to go. They wanted to make it to Salmone, but they couldn't, and they end up south of Crete, and they kind of used that as a buffer area as well. And eventually they're going to end up in Fair Havens. So we moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens. So they're a little bit off course already. Already things are not going perfectly. But they've made it to Fair Havens, and they stopped there, and that's where the journey will continue next week. Well, tonight we learned that God has a will. God has a purpose. God has a plan. But that doesn't mean that that plan won't come up against obstacles. In fact, I think many leaders have said, if you have a great plan, a great vision, you absolutely are going to run into obstacles. If you didn't have to run into obstacles, everybody would get there. It's overcoming the obstacles that determines those who make it to the vision and see the fulfillment of their vision. So God's plan often runs up against obstacles, and we face those constantly in life. But we can be like Paul, cling to the promises of God. Don't put our eyes on the obstacles. Keep our eyes on God's promises. Because when we keep our eyes on the obstacles, we're going to be like everybody else on the boat. We'll get depressed and we'll feel like giving up. But if we keep our eyes on the promises of God, then the vision that's before us can see fulfillment. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you that you are such a good God. Thank you that you guide us and direct us every step of the way. Thank you, Father, for this incredible journey that Paul's going to take and how his faith in you just grows and blossoms. And Father, may that be true in our life as well, that our faith in you is just grounded on your promises, that even though life around us may be difficult, we may be facing obstacles, we may be facing things that potentially could get us down, that we need to keep our focus on you and keep moving forward for you, knowing that you have made a promise and you always keep your promises. So, Father, help us day by day to keep our eyes on you. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.